Hey guys, Michael J. Crawford here, and first and foremost, let me apologize. The intent when we created this channel was to post regular content at least 2 or 3 times a week. Obviously, I haven't been doing that lately. My recent health situation has made that difficult, if not impossible. I am going in for surgery tomorrow, and hopefully that will help alleviate some of these problems. And so if you are a believer, I would ask that you keep me in prayers. And my next video will hopefully be an update as to how my health situation is doing. But for right now, I do want to correct the fact that I have not been posting any content that was really the point of this channel in the first place. And so I do want to open up a dialogue of sorts with some of my non-believing friends out there. And if you are a non-believer, please, 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 I'm not interested in mockery. I'm not interested in basically just being argumentative for argument's sake. I want to have a genuine, open discussion on these topics. And I know that it can be very difficult to have a genuine, open conversation on some of these topics because we all get very emotional when it comes to some of these subjects. And so I will ask you to bring your A game as far as your intellect, but leave the snarkiness and the mockery at the door because there's no point to it. And that doesn't serve you nor me. It doesn't help the cause of atheism or theism if we're simply hurling insults at each other. And here's the problem that I find with atheism as of late. And this is something that I've never really given some serious thought about until very, very recently. And that is, the more I examine atheism, and keep in mind, for those of you that don't know me particularly well, I did spend a significant amount of my adult life as an atheist. And so I made many of the arguments that I'm going to be refuting in the course of future videos. But it's kind of funny because I never really realized it. But the big problem with atheistic argumentation is that there is none at all. And I know that might sound crazy to many of you because, heck, atheists and various theists have been arguing on YouTube since YouTube's existed, and atheists and theists have been arguing as long as philosophy has even existed. But I still maintain, and I challenge the non-believers out there, if you have an answer to this, please, by all means, put it in the comments, and I will absolutely address it in a future video. I've yet to hear an actual argument for atheism or against theism. Now, the problem that we run into most of the time is that when we have this conversation, if a theist asks for an argument for atheism, the most common response from the atheist is that they're not making a positive claim, therefore they don't have a burden of proof. You have the burden of proof, and that ends the conversation at that point. And then sometimes it devolves into mockery and that kind of thing. And first of all, that might be fine if we're in a formal debate where one person is taking a positive and the other person is taking a negative position. That might be fine if we're in a court of law trying to determine the innocence or guilt of a particular party. And of course, at least in the American judicial system, you are innocent until proven guilty, so the burden of proof falls on the prosecution, not on the defense. So there are cases where the burden of proof argument is very appropriate. But for the most part, in real life, that's completely erroneous. So to give you a non-philosophical example, let's suppose that you're thinking about getting a new car, and you've decided that you want to get a Ford Explorer. Now, I immediately object and say, you know what? You do not want to get a Ford Explorer. To which you would respond, well, wait a minute. Why shouldn't I get a Ford Explorer? I've been reading this stuff on it. It seems like a pretty good vehicle. And my response to you is, well, you're the one making a positive claim that you should get a Ford Explorer. I'm simply lacking that assertion that you should get a Ford Explorer. So the burden of proof is on you to prove to me why you should get a Ford Explorer. Now, is that going to make any sense to you whatsoever? Of course not. It sounds patently absurd. But this is the line of argumentation that many atheists use in non-formal, non-legal discussion, and that makes no sense whatsoever to me. I understand that it's much easier to hide behind a burden of proof statement than to actually make an argument for your position. Of course that's easier. It's also a cop-out, and it's also a methodology to try and simply avoid the truth of the matter, which is that there are no strong arguments against theism or for atheism. Now, most of the time, and again, I know people are probably, if you're a non-believer and you're still with me, I appreciate that because we're going to go somewhere with this. But many of you are probably already thinking of various arguments that you've heard of against theism or for atheism. But I would ask you to engage your critical thinking for a minute. Are these actually arguments against theism or for atheism? Or are these arguments simply revolving around a specific doctrine? For example, the creation versus evolution debate, which I've done a previous video on and why I think it's a waste of time. But the young earth creationist is only a minority within Christianity. And of course, Christianity is one of many faiths, but there are, and there are young earth creationists in other religions. But it's not a universal thing that if you believe in God, you must believe in a young earth model. So if you're arguing over young earth creationism, you're not arguing over theism. You're arguing over a specific doctrine within theism. And the problem is that doctrinal argumentation only makes sense if you have common ground. So, for example, if we're going to discuss, let's say, the ramifications of Genesis chapter 1 and the creation week, then in order to have a meaningful discussion, we would both have to agree on the authority of the Bible. Well, the atheist obviously patently would reject that. So then we need to go back to an argument about the authority of the Bible. But again, in order to believe in the authority of the Bible, you have to believe in the existence of God, which again, the atheist is going to patently reject. So the argument needs to go back to theism versus atheism. Does God exist or not? That is the core question. And unfortunately, that's a question that both sides tend to avoid. And I think it's a real shame. And, you know, I've been looking around on YouTube at various atheists and Christians and their various arguments, and I see very little real argumentation for or against theism. And I'm just tired of it. I think we need good argumentation on both sides. So I challenge you, if you're an atheist, to respond to this video with a genuine argument, not a mockery, not an attack, not a just an insult, but a real argument as to why atheism is true, or conversely, why theism is false. But in looking around, I decided that, it would be very easy to pick one of thousands of atheists on YouTube that put out some very sloppy argumentation and try to pick them apart. That would not be fair. So I decided to go for a more intellectual approach. I'm going to try to find atheists that I feel are intellectually sound individuals and listen to their argumentation and try to see if their argumentation holds water or not. And so to start off this series, I'm going to talk about Dr. Michael Shermer. Now, if you're not aware of who Dr. Michael Shermer is, he's the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine. He for something like 18 years, he was a columnist for Scientific American. This is all on his website, on his bio. And he also held a prestigious position, I can't remember exactly what it was, but at Chapman University, he teaches Skepticism 101. So this is a guy who, if nothing else, you would have to admit is very educated on the subject. So I wanted to see what he had to say about this. Now, I'm using a few clips from a show called Closer to Truth. And Closer to Truth is an interesting enough show. It's, I think, a little misleading in its title because it's really closer to pushing a particular position. But but he does have good interviews with some of these intellectuals, and I'm going to be using clips of several of his shows over the course of the future here on this channel because I think he has some really solid interviews, assuming I don't get a copyright strike for this one. And in this interview with Michael, he professes that he is going to give a positive argument for atheism, which is something, when I heard that, I'm like, okay, I don't care what the argument is, I gotta respond to this because that is such a rare thing to hear a positive argument for theism. So let's hear, and I'm not showing the whole video, I'm just showing clips, but let's hear Dr. Michael Shermer's positive argument for atheism.
What are atheism's best arguments?
The approach I take is more positive, actually, in the sense of there's actually positive arguments against the idea that there is a God, which is anthropological, psychological, sociological studies of religion. And so the fact that where you happen to be born tells us which God you believe in and which religion you adhere to. And the fact that there's 10,000 different religions around the world, at least, if not more, and thousands of different gods, that's a strong indication that we created God, not vice versa.
Now, first and foremost, let me say this. I am only showing clips of the video, not the video in its entirety. If you feel that I might be taking something out of context, I will link the full video in the description below so that you can view the entirety of the interview. However, this is the gist of his so-called positive argument for atheism. That is the idea that your particular branch of theism is based more on where you were born, where you were raised, etc., than any other factor. So if you happen to grow up in the Western world, you're more likely to be Christian. If you happen to grow up in India, you'll be more likely to be Hindu, etc. Now, I've heard this argument many times from other atheists, but there's a couple of problems with it. Is that almost every atheist that uses this form of argumentation in and of themselves refutes that argumentation, because unless Michael himself grew up in an atheist community, then based on his own argumentation, he should be whatever religion happens to be dominant in his area. Now, you could argue that he came from he did grow, I don't know his whole story, but maybe he did grow up in a religious household, but then he threw off the shackles of religion later on in life. But again, that still refutes the argumentation, because if you can, upon reaching maturity, change your mind about core beliefs such as your religion or your belief in theism or atheism, then I guess it's not necessary that it comes from your upbringing or the region. This is also, and this is really the core of the problem, is not even that, because I would grant you that, of course, if you happen to be in an area that is predominantly, say, Muslim, you're more likely to be a Muslim. If you're in an area that is predominantly Christian, you're more likely to be Christian. That goes without saying. I mean, because religions do tend to be geographically bound. And in many cases, it's not simply because of you're raised with strong sense of morality in this particular faith or something, as much as that, unfortunately, in many areas of the world, it's not a matter of choice. There are parts of the world where if you do not conform to the societal norms as far as religious belief, that you could be putting your very life in jeopardy. We tend to ignore this in the Western world, where we tend to enjoy much more freedom. And by the way, interestingly enough, in the Western world, where we have all these freedoms, is where atheism is so significantly on the rise. Because people have the right to choose what they want to choose in countries like the United States, and therefore people that simply don't want to have a religious belief don't have to. And so we see a huge surge in atheism. And I think those freedoms are a good thing. I would rather have people genuinely believe in atheism than to believe in Christianity against their will. So I do think that kind of diffuses his argumentation a little bit. But even if it didn't, even if I granted with 100% certainty his premises, the argument is still a fallacious argument because it makes no claim about the truth value of a religion or of the existence of God. It simply points to the origin of that belief. And that's something that in philosophy is known as the genetic fallacy, or the origins fallacy. That is that your argument is wrong because of where you got it. That does not stand to reason. Just because you may have become a Christian because your parents were Christian is not an indicator of the truth value of Christianity. Now, the problem is that it gets much, much worse from there, because as they go back and forth, Michael attempts to defend his position a little bit by showing more evidence that the so-called religious experience is something that can be easily reproduced.
We made gods and God did not make us. Because, for example, if you stimulate certain parts of the temporal lobe, people will experience floating out of their body. They'll experience a sense presence. There's an invisible being in the room with me right now. I can just sense him here. And you can just poke around there and do brain stimulation. You can do it with like electromagnetic fields. You can do it through sleep deprivation, through hunger and starvation.
So in this part of his argumentation, and this is another thing I have heard before, which is unfortunate. There's very little new thought in the atheist argumentation, which is unfortunate because, as I said before, it doesn't feel like there really is much argumentation from the atheistic side. And we'll get into arguments for theism in future videos. That's not the point of this particular video. But further, I'm not going to get into some of the classical arguments for atheism. Well, I wouldn't even say for atheism, but arguments against theism, which Michael does use in this interview, things like the problem of evil and stuff. We'll get into that in future videos as well. But this idea of brain stimulation, I think, is an interesting one. That you can stimulate different parts of the brain to create various sensations that one could describe as similar to a religious experience, and that somehow nullifies the religious experience. And I genuinely am confused by why people would find this convincing at all. And at least anybody that understands the mechanics of the brain. Look, I'm no neurologist. I've been seeing a neurologist due to some of the issues that I've been having, but I'm not an expert on how the brain works. But I do know enough to know that, yes, you can stimulate different parts of the brain in order to simulate various sensations. So, for example, you can make a person feel the sensation that they're hot, that they're cold. You can make them feel various emotional states. You can make them feel all sorts of different sensations. You can make them feel like they're hungry. And, of course, as he was saying, you can make them feel like they're floating out of their body, that they sense a presence in the room, that kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing about all that is all the other things that we can simulate are simulations of actual things. You can simulate being hot because you're stimulating the same part of the brain that would be stimulated by being in a hot environment. You can simulate being hungry because you stimulate the same part of the brain that indicates when you are in fact hungry. So simply being able to recreate feelings in the brain is in no way, shape, or form a suggestion that those feelings, that those sensations don't have a normal counterpart, that there isn't something out there that can cause those feelings, for lack of a better term, naturally, or in the case of something divine, supernaturally. There's nothing that indicates that these are false sensations, only that these are sensations that can be duplicated by stimulating the brain directly, along with thousands of other stimulations that you can have. So I really don't think that that is an indicator of a falsehood of theism at all. And in fact, you could argue that if anything, it would be an indicator that the sensation of a spiritual presence is every bit as real as the sensation of being hungry. And he even takes it to another level, which, in my opinion, is mind-boggling, that he doesn't see the fault with this argument, and that many out there in the atheist community don't see the fault with this argument. But listen carefully, keeping in mind what I just said, to this particular set of argumentation that he uses in this last clip we're going to show.
That so many people do that is a demonstration that there's some deep need.
Right, exactly. A deep need that evolved like all of our other needs. And you could just start with something like hunger, and thirst, and sex. I mean, really basic drives that obviously we evolved for very specific reasons for survival. But you just start building onto that all these other beliefs that are really no different.
So on this final point, I think Michael and I actually agree to a certain extent. See, he argues that our need to connect to a higher power is an evolved trait, much like the sex drive, the hunger drive, that our need to connect with fellow believers as a social construct is an evolved trait, much like our sex drive and our hunger drive. But he fails to see, and quite frankly, I'm shocked that someone of his intellect would fail to see, and I would challenge you, if you're an atheist, to consider this for a minute. That no one argues that because your hunger, your need and drive to feed is an evolved trait means that food doesn't exist. Likewise, your evolved trait to want to connect to a higher power is not an indication that that higher power does not exist. Take care.